All right, so today is just a quick video on Abigail. My hypothesis is that in the original narrative, Abigail was a slave of David who ran away from David to serve Nabal. All right, so if you don't know already, most of the Bible is propaganda. This narrative about Abigail is no exception, and so the biblical author is going to be trying to subvert the narrative, taking elements from the oral tradition about Abigail and placing them into a new context, in this case in 1 Samuel chapter 25. So we need to start off by taking a look at who was Abigail, and to do this we will once again use the redundant lie technique used by biblical authors. And that is when they repeat the same information over and over again, and it gives us a clue as to what their agenda was. And in this case, we'll be taking a look at Abigail's relationship with Nabal. And it says that they are married 4 times, which isn't a crazy amount, but this narrative is only 1 chapter long. But if we move beyond chapter 25, we see that the biblical narrative says that they are a husband and wife an additional 3 times, even after she is married to David. So it gets a little suspicious. And we can infer from that Abigail was not Nabal's wife. So if Abigail wasn't Nabal's wife, then who was she? Well, we have to take a look at David and Abigail's relationship. And they refer to each other as master, or that's often translated Lord in a lot of versions. Slave and servant, and they do that 21 times. And again, this narrative is only 1 chapter long. And so most of the time when you have something repeated like that, the opposite would have been the case in the original narrative. But in this case, it's the same. And so I think they actually were master and slave. But the biblical author is going to be changing that from literal master and slave to a figurative master and slave. So we see that when Abigail talks to David, she says, "On me alone, my Lord, be the blame, and please let your slave speak to you and listen to the words of your slave." And then again, she's talking to David, "Behold, your slave is a servant to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." So that last one even seems a little over the top. Even though the biblical author is trying to communicate respect and humility, it still comes across as a literal master and slave relationship. So how did Abigail get from David to Nabal? Well, I think she was a runaway slave, and I think we have an element from that narrative in the biblical narrative that the biblical author is trying to change. And so Nabal says, but Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master." So the biblical author is taking that phrase that was part of the original narrative, and he's changing it from Abigail and David, from David breaking away from Saul. So if Abigail was a slave, the biblical author is going to have to explain Abigail's association with other slaves. We saw this, and actually this narrative is very similar to the Ruth video that I did, since Ruth was also a slave. And so that in that narrative, the biblical author had to explain Ruth's association with other slave. And so we have a similar situation here. And so much of the communication that Abigail does is going to be with either Nabal's servants or David's servants, and so she's in association with servants, but it's in a different way, and in a way that she is not a servant herself. She is distinguished by pretty much all the time riding on a donkey, which a slave would not typically do. And then in this verse here, it says she had 5 female attendants. So when the biblical narrative would be trying to propose this new explanation for Abigail, the original reader would have been like, "Hold on, wait a minute, we've never heard of this part of the story before." And typical technique that a biblical author would use would be to put that information the reader didn't know into some kind of secret meeting. And we have this same thing here in the Abigail narrative. And in verses 19 through 20, it says that Abigail did not tell her husband Nabal, and also she met David in the hidden part of the mountain so that no one saw them. So who was Nabal? And I have Nabal here in quotation marks because I don't think his name was Nabal. And just in general, knowing things about Nabal is a little tough because there's just not that much information about him. But we can maybe find out a few things, even though they're a little more speculative. And one is that his name was not Nabal. Right? The narrative here tells us that his name is Nabal 3 times, 2 times here in this verse, and that his name means fool or stupidity, and so it's a little just too on the nose for this narrative that the villain of the story name means stupidity, and so I think that is a little suspicious, and I don't think his name was actually Nabal. This is in contrast with Abigail, who is described as a woman of intelligence. So I do think Nabal was part of the original narrative, but I think it was just a descriptive term, not a name, and it may have even referred to Abigail herself, since the biblical author is taking steps to describe her as intelligent. The second thing about Nabal is that this incident may not have taken place in Carmel. That's Carmel in the southern Judean wilderness, not the Mount Carmel in northern Israel. And so this incident may not have taken place in Carmel, just because in the first paragraph we're told that it takes place in Carmel 4 times. And so that goes along with that redundant lie technique once again. And then finally, Nabal may have been a king. It says in verse 36 that he had a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And this is typical technique of the biblical author to take something and say, no, it wasn't really that. It was just like that. And so in this case, it was, Nabal was not really a king. He just had a feast like a king. So again, just a few things that we can kind of speculate about Nabal is that 1, his name was not Nabal. 2, the incident did not take place in Carmel. And 3, he may have been king. All right, so why change the narrative about a slave? Well, in this case, I think it really comes down to the descendants of Abigail, and they were trying to make a power play and trying to maintain that they were descendants of David. And maybe they were descendants of David. There is some, it seems in the original narrative, David was not the most virtuous of characters, and there may even be some evidence that he acted inappropriately with his slaves, which I'll try to do a blog post on that in the future. But regardless, even if the descendants of Abigail were descendants of David, they still didn't want their mom to be known as a slave, and so that narrative needed to be changed. All right, so that is it for today. Please like and share this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.